My name is Benneth and I am the Reefs Go Live intern here at CCMI, and I'll be your topside host today, alongside Brooke, our marine education intern, who will be your underwater host. And Brooke is wearing specialised scuba gear which allows her to hear me and speak to all of you. So let's take a moment to say hi to her now. Hi Brooke!
All over the world, thank you for tuning in as we discuss reproduction on the reef and explore our beautiful reefs of Little Cayman. Today we want to hear from you, so if you have any questions during the broadcast, make sure you drop them in the chat box, and we'll try to answer them as many as we can. To get things started, how about you guys tell us where you're from?
Absolutely, we would be thrilled to connect with all of you watching today. And throughout today's broadcast on reproduction on the reef, we will be diving into all your questions and messages, so please do send those through. Now, helping to bring you this live broadcast today, Brooke and I have a fantastic team with us from CCMI, both on the boat and in the water. So let's give a big shout out to them now. Amazing, and let's give a shout out to some of you that are tuned in. So we have Peter from Little Cayman and Catherine from Maine. We also have Sean from Stockton. And that's all that I can see for now, but keep sending in your messages and we'll continue to give some shout outs. So, to kick things off, let's head back down to Brooke while we take a moment to appreciate the diversity of life that we can find in our oceans.
Thanks, Bennett. From the tiniest of microorganisms that are invisible to the naked eye, to all these reef fish that are all around me, and to the largest animal that's existed, the blue whale. The ocean is home to all these animals. The ocean's home to a large range and variety of animals and habitats. That's called biodiversity. And this isn't a surprise since the ocean takes up most of our living space here on Earth. And we can thank all this biodiversity to the coral reefs. Isn't that right, Bennett?
That's right. Corals are key to facilitating the exceptional biodiversity that we find in the ocean. In fact, coral reefs are home to 25% of all marine life, even though they cover less than 1% of the seafloor. This makes coral reefs one of the most diverse habitats on the planet, and it's the reason that they are nicknamed the rainforests of the sea. And the intricate and three-dimensional structure of the reef is actually one of its most important attributes, providing numerous nooks and crannies for small creatures to hide within. The reef therefore offers shelter and protection from predators and strong currents for a wide range of organisms. Many animals also rely on the reef, therefore, during their critical early life stages because it provides a secure environment for young animals to grow and live in until they reach a size where they are big enough to venture out on their own. This means coral reefs are excellent nursery grounds, similar to mangroves with their dense and tangled root systems. Isn't that right, Brooke?
That's right, Bennett. And I see a great example of a complex reef structure. As you can see right here, you can see a bunch of different organisms hanging around, including these tiny little flamingo-tongue snails. Coral reefs provide excellent many roles for all these organisms, including to seek shelter, come to reproduce, find food, and even just to socialize. Speaking of which, Bennett, can you tell how we can classify all these different animals that we see here on the reef?
I would love to, thank you, Brooke. So, as scientists, we can group organisms based on similar features that they share, and we can separate them based on characteristics which make them different. This is called classification, and it helps us communicate more effectively about the natural world. It helps us make comparisons across species, and it also gives us an insight into the evolutionary history of organisms. And the area of science concerned with the classification of organisms is called taxonomy. And scientists like Carl Linnaeus played a huge role in helping us figure all this out. And it's the reason he's nicknamed the father of taxonomy. And the classification system that we use today, the Linnaean system, is even named after him, and it starts with broad categories that narrow down into more specific ones. So a broad level of classification might be plants and animals, for example. We can then further separate species within these categories using more specific characteristics. So one way we might do this with plants is by looking at whether they produce flowers or not. So plants can either be flowering or non-flowering. Now, I have a question for everyone watching. We have lots and lots of flowering plants on land, but how many flowering plants do you think we have in the sea? So there's actually a poll in the chat, and we would love it if you could complete that for us, and we'll come back and read out your answers in a moment. But in the meantime, Brooke, can you tell us how we might go about classifying some of the animals that we find down there on the reef?
Of course, Bennett. As scientists, we can divide animals based on characteristics we share. For animals, we divide them whether they have a backbone or not. So if they have a backbone, we'll call them vertebrates. That's just like you and me. If they lack a backbone, we'll call them invertebrates.
Thank you for those definitions, Brooke. So let's start with the vertebrates, like fish. All fish have a backbone, and they come in many different colours, shapes and sizes. From the tiny fairy basslet, which are the little half yellow, half purple fish you can see in this video, to the majestic nurse shark, which you can also see having a little rest on the seafloor there. Some fish, such as parrotfish, are like the gardeners of the reef, and they munch on algae to keep it from smothering the corals. Others, like the Nassau grouper, which are predators, keep the population of smaller fish in check. And then there are the cleaner wrasses, who do a special job of keeping other fish clean and healthy by eating parasites off their skin. As for the invertebrates, these sometimes include the squishy-looking animals, like jellyfish, octopus and squid, for example. It also includes things like sea worms, such as these funky-looking Christmas tree worms that you might find on dives here in Little Cayman. They act as effective water filters as they take in floating particles in the water for their food. Some invertebrates have a hard external shell called an exoskeleton, like the Caribbean spiny lobster. Sea snails also have hard external shells, and here's a close-up of the colourful flamingo tongue which Brooke pointed out earlier. And if you're from the Cayman Islands, then you've almost definitely heard of the iconic queen conch. These are a big type of sea snail, and they play an important role as recyclers on the reef, helping to recycle nutrients in the sand. And some invertebrates don't move, and so it's sometimes easy to mistake them for a type of plant or rock. Brooke, can you see any examples down there?
Yes, Bennett. I see tons of invertebrates down here. One of my favorite invertebrates are corals. Corals don't look like your typical marine animal, but they are invertebrates. They're in the phylum Cnidarians, which is the same phylum as jellyfish. This coral right here is our mountainous star coral. They're known for their big Cheerio-like polyps. Corals are made up of these polyps that are almost like tentacle-like. And all these polyps come together to form the coral colony. And over thousands and even millions millions of years, these corals grow to form our coral reefs.
Amazing, thank you, Brooke. So we can see how the coral reef is like an underwater neighbourhood with all the many different groups of organisms working together to make the reef a great place to live. But what do we have at the centre of all this diversity? Well, it's coral reproduction. After all, if corals didn't reproduce in the way that they do, we wouldn't have our reefs, and if we didn't have our reefs, we wouldn't have all this other diversity. But before we explain more about coral reproduction, let's see some of the answers that you guys put in for our poll about how many different types of flowering plants are in the sea. So, we have 1 vote for 10 plus flowering plants, and we have 2 votes for 4 flowering plants, and 1 vote for none. Oh, so we actually just have an updated version, so 50% of respondents said 1 flowering plant, and the other 50% said 12 types of flowering plants. Okay, so those of you that guessed there was 1 type of flowering plant actually got it right. So there is only 1, and that is seagrass. So seagrass do produce flowers, and this is one of their ways of reproducing. So male male flowers release pollen into the water, and then this fertilizes the female flowers to make new seeds. So all other plants in the ocean are non-flowering, such as algae, for example. Okay, so let's get back into the main focus of today's lesson, which is coral reproduction. So corals have an incredible ability to reproduce both sexually and asexually, and each method provides a vital role to the growth and survival of coral reefs. So asexual reproduction involves just 1 parent, and this makes an exact copy of itself. Sexual reproduction, on the other hand, involves 2 parents, 1 male and 1 female. And the DNA from each parent combines to form a unique individual which has traits from both, like how you might have your mum's eyes but your dad's nose, for example. And however, each of these methods do have their advantages and disadvantages, which we'll go on to explore. So Brooke, please can you start us off by telling us a little bit about asexual reproduction in corals and how they do this?
Yes, I would love to. Corals can asexually reproduce in 2 ways, through budding and fragmentation. Let's start with budding. So remember when I was talking about the coral polyps earlier? Well, when corals grow, so do their polyps. And when the coral polyps grows large enough, it can essentially split or pinch off, creating a whole identical polyp. And the corals will repeat this process over and over until it has a whole new coral. Fragmentation is a little different. During this process, it's when a piece of the coral will break off. This can happen during just the natural growth process of the coral, or external factors like storms, or when a parrotfish grazed on the algae. When this happens, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because the coral piece can go and reattach on a hard surface somewhere else. It's kind of like if my arm fell off and a whole new brick started to form.
Thank you, Brooke. That was a great explanation. And just before we continue, we have Kai saying hello from Indiana, and we also have Holly and Bill from Oregon are also tuning in today. So, anyway, both budding and fragmentation are nature's ways of creating duplicates, ensuring the continued growth and expansion of the reef. So sexual reproduction, on the other hand, involves male and female reproductive cells, the eggs and the sperm, and these are collectively known as gametes. So corals can release millions of gametes into the water all at the same time in a spectacular event known as broadcast spawning. Once these gametes have been released into the water, they float to the surface where they can mingle with other gametes. And when the male gamete from one coral meets the female gamete from another, they combine to form a free-floating baby coral. These baby corals then sink back down to the seafloor where they can attach to a hard surface. And this step is really important because corals don't grow free-floating in the water. Now, a cool fact about this part of the life cycle, where a baby coral attaches to a hard surface, is that it can actually be influenced by sound. So, coral reefs make lots of noise, from all the croaking and grunting of fish to the crackling and snapping of fish, shrimp and other invertebrates. So this kind of creates an orchestra, and the baby corals use this sound to figure out where a good place to settle would be. And they are attracted to reefs that are making lots of noise because this indicates that the reef is thriving and healthy. So once the baby coral has attached to a hard surface, it can then transform into a polyp, much like how a caterpillar transforms into a butterfly. And once this has happened, the polyp can continue to grow, dividing in half through budding, as Brooke already mentioned, and as more and more polyps are added, a colony forms. So this all sounds good, right? But Brooke, can you think of any potential disadvantages of coral spawning?
Yeah, Bennett, there's a few I can think of. Coral gametes are a top item on some predators' food list. So when corals release all their gametes, it creates a feeding frenzy in the water column. A lot of these coral gametes won't make it down to the seafloor to attach. Corals make up for this though. This is why they release so many gametes at once. But releasing so many gametes takes up a lot of energy. This is why coral spawns only once or twice a year. Another disadvantage is that coral spawning has to be very precise. If coral spawning isn't done just at the right time, the coral gametes from different colonies won't have the chance to mix, and we won't get a coral baby.
Thank you, Brooke. So now you guys that are watching might be wondering, if there's such a high risk factor associated with coral spawning, yet it requires so much energy from them, then why do they even bother doing it? Well, there is an answer, and we'd like you all to have a little think about what this might be and pop your answers in the chat box, and we'll come back and read those out in a moment. But in the meantime, let's talk about how corals know precisely when to spawn all at the same time, as Brooke just mentioned. So, coral spawning is triggered by numerous environmental cues, such as water temperature and also the moon. So, coral spawning happens during the warmer months of the year, usually after sunset. And it's important to note, while it is important that all corals spawn at the same time, our warmer months of the year here in the Cayman Islands is different to the warmer months of the year in Australia, for example. So with these big regional gaps, coral spawning does happen at different times, but within the same region, it does have to be very precise. And they also use a full moon to do this. So coral spawning happens a few days after a full moon. So Brooke, can you tell us when we might expect coral spawning to happen here in the Cayman Islands?
In the Cayman Islands, coral spawning is expected to happen in the warm month of September. This year, the full moon is expected to happen September 17th, so we can expect corals to spawn a couple days after that. Corals spawning happens in a short window of only 20 to 30 minutes. And it usually happens at night. So it's a very rare event to see.
Thank you, Brooke. And I know that our big mountainous star corals here in the Cayman Islands produce a really big visual impact with their big polyps releasing all their gametes in just a few seconds. This creates a kind of underwater snowstorm effect with all the millions of tiny pink, white or yellow gametes drifting up to the surface. It can almost feel like being in a shaken up snow globe. I've never experienced this before, but Brooke, I know that you have lots of diving experience, so I'm just curious to see, have you ever witnessed coral spawning happen in real life before?
Unfortunately, I have not. Like I said, coral spawning is a very rare event to see. But back in 2016, our CCMI researchers got to witness our staghorn corals in our nursery spawn. They told me it was a really cool experience, and it's signs that our staghorn corals were healthy.
Exactly, thank you, Brooke, and I love that video on our YouTube channel. You can hear the excited screams from the divers as they see coral spawning happening. So anyway, I'm now going to go and see if we have any answers about the advantages of coral spawning. So, someone said that coral larvae can be swept into the current and distributed to different areas, and someone else said greater genetic diversity. So, those are both really great answers, and yes, so one of the most incredible things about coral spawning is the boost that it gives to genetic diversity. And genetic diversity refers to the variety of different traits in a group of organisms. We also have another answer that's just come in. So someone said a lot of marine life, like coral spawning, because it provides food. So yes, they do like coral spawning, and as we said, this is one of the disadvantages of coral spawning because all the gametes just get eaten. But anyway, back to the advantage of genetic diversity. So having lots of different traits is really important because genetic traits is really important because it helps corals tackle different problems, allowing species to bounce back from tough times and thrive in the face of ever-changing conditions. So, have you ever noticed how some people catch colds more often than others? So this is partly because we are all genetically different. So, I am genetically different to Brooke, Brooke is genetically different to you, and you are genetically different to whoever is sat next to you. And this means we all have slightly different characteristics, and some of these might provide us with added protection against illness, while others lessen our protection against illness. So this is the exact same for corals. So let's imagine that all the corals in an area are all genetically the same, and they are all prone to catching a specific disease. So if a disease comes along and hits that reef, then all the corals will get sick. But if we have genetic diversity, then there is a greater chance that some of the corals will be resistant to that disease and only a few of them will get sick. So, while coral spawning might seem like a risky endeavour, it is a crucial part of keeping reefs resilient through the boost that it gives to genetic diversity. Now, asexual reproduction doesn't offer genetic diversity, but it is much easier for them. It requires a lot less energy and it happens more than once a year. So this essentially just contributes to the continued expansion of the reef, allowing corals to cover more area. So we're going to quickly check in with our dive team now. So Brooke, are you guys doing okay down there?
We're doing great down here, Bennett. Thank you for checking in.
Fabulous. Okay, so we're now just going to see if anyone has any questions so far. So I'm just going to see if anything's been put in. So, Leon from Germany has actually asked, I'm aware that other types of animals also use broadcast spawning to reproduce, and can we give any examples of these? So Leon, I'm really glad you asked that question. So we actually have the Nassau grouper here in the Cayman Islands, which is an iconic yet endangered species. And this animal also uses broadcast spawning to reproduce, and it has a very special story specific to Little Cayman. And our underwater host Brooke actually knows lots about this, so I'm going to pass this one on to her. Brooke, can you tell us about this?
Of course, Bennett. The Nassau grouper is a conservation success story here in the Cayman Islands. Nassau groupers broadcast spawn once a year in what we call an aggregation. All these groupers come in the thousands to meet at one place called an aggregation site, which is essentially a meet and greet. All groupers in the thousands became a pattern which fishermen picked up on, and they became a target for overfishing, to the point where Nassau groupers were facing extinction. This is when the Cayman government and several non-profits joined together to launch a project called Grouper Moon. And this involved stating fishing bans, education projects, and also researching the reproduction of Nassau groupers. Today, the Nassau groupers just have one aggregation site, and it's actually on the west end of Little Cayman. This year, the aggregation happened at the end of January with the full moon, and 8,000 groupers showed up, which is a great recovery from the low numbers that we were seeing in the late 2000s. We're hoping in the future we'll see more aggregation sites pop up around the Cayman Islands as they regenerate their numbers.
Thank you, Brooke. I love that story. So we've got some more questions. So Kate in the UK has asked, can you see coral spawning with the human eye? So yes, you can. So while the gametes are really tiny, because they release so many of them, millions into the water, you can see this effect. And as I already mentioned, it's kind of like being in an underwater snowstorm. And you can really see how the visibility will just drop in a few seconds when coral spawning starts to happen, because you'll just be surrounded by all these gametes. It's like being in a cloud, a pink or white cloud underwater. So we also have a question from Chris in Grand Cayman. So, does climate change impact coral spawning? So this is a really good question, and climate change does impact coral spawning. We actually touch on this in our next section, so I'm just going to head into that right now. So unfortunately, due to the precise timing of coral spawning, which relies heavily on environmental cues, there are several threats to coral spawning under changing global conditions. So us humans are actually impacting the precise timing of coral spawning. And Brooke, can you tell us how this happens?
Yes, Bennett. I just want to quickly introduce my fish friend that I made while you guys were answering questions. This is a yellowhead wrasse. Wrasses are actually really special for reproduction because they live in social hierarchies. This yellowhead wrasse is a super male, and they like to eat little things in the sand, and that's why they're hanging around me right now. She's actually trying to pick things off my mask. But, as I was saying, wrasses live in a social hierarchy where they'll have a really dominant super male, and the rest around them will be females. So when the super male dies, they'll pick the most dominant female to change sex and color to take the super male's place. It's a really cool thing that happens down here on the reef. But back to your guys' question. Our reefs are changing, and that happens with our environmental cues that are going on our planet. And this is a very important topic to talk about. Some environmental cues that I can think of right off the bat is light pollution and global warming. Our night skies are brighter than ever. And corals rely on the moon to know when to reproduce. So if the sky is really bright, the corals might think it's a different moon cycle than it actually is, leading to the mismatch of coral spawning. Secondly, with global warming and the rise in ocean temperatures, the corals might think it's actually a warmer month than what it is, also leading corals to spawn earlier. And this could lead to some coral colonies releasing their gametes at an earlier time than others.
Exactly, thank you, Brooke. So, Chris in Grand Cayman, that was a really good explanation of how climate change is impacting coral spawning through global warming. Now, not only are we impacting the timing of coral spawning, we are also impacting whether it even happens or not. So, as we already mentioned, coral spawning does require a lot of energy from the coral. And for this reason, only healthy corals that can afford to put their energy into spawning do so. Corals that have been hit by a disease, for example, they need to focus all their energy into getting better and essentially just keeping themselves alive. So, this coral spawning is actually becoming an even rarer event than it already was, because some of these damaged corals just don't have the energy to do it anymore. And not only this, but coral gametes are also very sensitive, and they can be easily harmed by pollutants in the water. And damaged gametes are less likely to combine to form a healthy baby coral. However, even if everything else is fine and everything else goes to plan, the final stage in coral spawning is for the baby coral to attach to a hard surface, and high levels of sedimentation, which is essentially just lots of sand smothering the corals, means that we are reducing the amount of hard surfaces available for these baby corals to attach to. And remember, if they can't attach to a hard surface, then they can't develop into a polyp and grow. Okay, so we're just now going to quickly check in with our dive team again. Are you guys all okay?
We're doing great down here, Bennett. Thank you for asking.
Okay, so we can see how, due to all the threats that we are having on coral reproduction, and we've also talked about how coral reproduction is really important for the survival and growth of coral reefs, we as humans need to do whatever we can to try and protect coral reproduction, however possible. And we can actually do that through coral restoration. So coral restoration is where we assist the recovery of corals that have been damaged, aiming to return the reef's structure, function and key species back to what it was before it was damaged. And actually, we can use the processes of coral reproduction in our coral restoration efforts. So, Brooke, can you tell us how we might use asexual reproduction to help us carry out coral restoration?
Of course. So do you remember earlier when I mentioned fragmentation? You know, when a little piece of the coral falls off the colony? Well, we can utilize this process in our coral nursery. And our coral nursery is a protected place. Unfortunately, we can't be in CCMI's coral nursery today due to weather conditions, but I did bring a demonstration. This is what a coral nursery would look like, with a frame, and these little pieces right here are coral fragments. We hang them up on lines so they are protected. And in coral nurseries, they are protected in their most vulnerable stages of their life until they grow. They are protected because I can monitor them. I can keep insides of corals bleaching, or if they start to get a disease, and then I can remove them from the nursery before they have a chance to infect the others with the disease. I could also make sure my nursery is nice and clean and free from competitors. In our ecosystem, everything is always competing for resources. This is things such as space, light, and food. An organism that competes with corals is algae. So a lot of times you'll see algae growing onto corals. So I can keep my nursery nice and clean, and corals can just focus all their energy on growing and not competing. This is why we can see corals in nurseries grow twice as fast. Once our corals get large enough, we can remove them from our nursery and place them back into the wild. This process is known as outplanting.
Thank you, Brooke. That was a really great explanation. So, all the way back in 2012, CCMI actually created the first ever coral nursery in the Cayman Islands in partnership with the Cayman Islands Department of Environment. And the nursery primarily does grow staghorn corals because they have really fast growth rates, and they were once a dominant species in the Caribbean, but they are now critically endangered. So since 2012, CCMI have been working to improve the success of our coral nursery, and that has involved looking at the way that we outplant our corals. And through trial and testing, we've actually seen that if we outplant our corals using these 3D dome structures, they actually have a 100% success rate after 6 months, because it lifts the coral fragments off the reef, and this kind of reduces some of that competition that Brooke was talking about. So another way that we can improve our restoration efforts is through incorporating genetic diversity into it. And we can do this by manipulating the natural process of coral spawning. So how this is possible.
Of course, Bennett. So when corals get a disease, and sorry, I'm getting distracted by her triggerfish over there. You see them, they're just swimming around. They are super cute. Anyway, when a coral gets a disease and they beat that disease and survive and they reproduce, they get resilient to that disease, and they can pass that resiliency on to the offspring. When they passing that resiliency off to the offspring over generations is called adaptation. Well, passing that offspring past generation to generation takes a lot of time. But essentially, we can speed up this process in a laboratory. And we do just that. All we need to do is first identify the resilient corals, and then second, mimic coral spawning to capture the resilient gametes. And we do this by mimicking the lights and the water temperature to get it just right so the corals think it's the right time to spawn. And once the corals spawn, we'll collect the gametes that have the resilient genes and mix them with other gametes that have the resilient genes. And we'll get coral babies that are resilient.
Thank you, Brooke, and that was really cool to see that triggerfish behind you there. So CCMI are actually doing some of this work. So we are looking at the genetic characteristics of our staghorn corals and looking to see which ones are the most resistant to things, and seeing if we can then breed these together and then outplant these most tolerant corals onto nearshore reefs. And something that our scientists found was that while some corals have high resistance to disease, they have a low resistance to temperature increases, and vice versa. So corals that have a high resistance to temperature increases, they had a lower resistance to disease. So there wasn't any one singular super coral that had resistance to everything, but this just reinforces the importance of maintaining genetic diversity on our reefs. So we are coming towards the end of our broadcast. So Brooke, we can answer a couple of questions if you guys are all okay down there.
Yeah, we can answer a few questions, Bennett.
Okay, so Maddie from Grand Cayman has asked you, Brooke, what is your favourite fish?
Yes, Bennett. I'm not sure if I can see one right now. But one of my favorite fish are parrotfish. So remember when I was explaining the wrasses earlier? Parrotfish do something similar, where they have a super male, and these super males are going to be our dominant males, and they're going to be the ones that we see that are bright greens and blues. And then the rest of the parrotfish are in their initial phase. And these ones are going to be smaller in size and also a completely different color. And then when our super male dies, sex and color to become this super male. So, and parrotfish too just play a really key role in our ecosystem. They're key herbivores, meaning that they eat plants like algae. You can see that they have almost like human-like teeth. They're known for their parrot-like beak. And this causes them to scrape algae off of corals. And in that process, sometimes they'll get little pieces of coral chunks that they'll digest, and they end up making sand. One parrotfish produces 1 ton of sand a year. Isn't that cool, Bennett?
That is really cool, Brooke. And unfortunately we have lost the camera feed down there, so I'm just going to wrap up this broadcast with a summary of what we've learnt today. So we have talked about how coral reefs are one of the most diverse habitats on the planet, and we've also seen how we can classify different organisms that call the coral reefs home, including the actual corals themselves. And we can see that coral reproduction is the foundation for all this other biodiversity, and so we really need to do what we can to try and protect coral reproduction however possible, and we can do that through various restoration efforts. Okay, so we can clearly see how understanding coral reproduction is so important, because if we can understand it, we can then use our knowledge to encourage and support the continued growth and survival of our reefs. So unfortunately, that is all that we have time for today. We would like to thank you all for taking part and listening to today's episode. We'd also love it if you could complete our sheet link side of the screen, and also remind you all to tune in for our final episode of Reefs Go Live on the 7th of June as we celebrate World Oceans Day, and there will be a live viewing of this in Cayman Bay Cinema in Grand Cayman, so all schools are welcome to come and watch this. So we hope to see you all then, but bye for now!